Todos nós sabemos que no mundo inteiro nunca os trabalhadores conseguiram ganhar nada sem que houvesse luta, sem que houvesse perseverança, sem que houvesse disposição de brigar até o fim.
This is Brazil's Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva from his days as a union leader. He worked from a young age to help support his family, eventually becoming a metal worker. As a leader of that union, he spent decades fighting for Brazil's working class and against the country's dictatorship. After Brazil transitioned to democracy, he took that fight to the top of Brazilian politics, eventually becoming president. During Lula's first presidency, he was beloved throughout Brazil. Around the world, some even called him
the most popular politician on earth.
By the time Lula left office in 2010, his approval ratings sat north of 80%. Now, more than a decade later, he's returning for a third term. But this time, things are different. Brazil faces several new crises, and even though Lula won, he did so with the narrowest of margins, which shows that the country's political wins could blow against a radical presidency. But how exactly did Lula get so popular during his first two terms, both in Brazil and around the world? And why might Lula 3.0 struggle to repeat this success and popularity today? Back in 2002, 22 million Brazilians lived in poverty. That's 12% of the country. And 9% of Brazilians were undernourished. Things needed to change. Enter President Lula da Silva, a former union leader from a working-class background. He had pledged to help the most vulnerable.
Se ao final do meu mandato, todos os brasileiros tiverem a possibilidade de tomar café da manhã, almoçar e jantar, terei cumprido a missão da minha vida.
From 2003, the year Lula took power, to 2010, his last year in office, Brazil's economy grew by about 4% annually. And Lula introduced social programs that spread these economic gains across Brazilian society. Like Bolsa Familia, a program that gave cash directly to Brazilians. Bolsa Familia helped reduce extreme poverty by an estimated 58%, and economic inequality by 41%. In fact, nearly 30% of Brazilian families saw their incomes rise thanks to the program. These Brazilians constituted what some called a new middle class. Others called Brazil's success under Lula an economic miracle. But a few years after Lula left office in 2011, that miracle and the commodity boom that enabled it ended. Around this time, Lula's presidency came under scrutiny for alleged corruption. The former president was convicted and jailed in 2018. But he was later released and exonerated after leaked audio showed that his prosecution was politically motivated. And when Jair Bolsonaro took power in 2019, his right-wing agenda pushed Brazil back to its pre-Lula days. By 2022, 61.3 million people in Brazil faced some level of hunger or food insecurity, and 100 million lived in poverty. In fact, the percentage of Brazilians living in extreme food insecurity skyrocketed after Bolsonaro became president in 2019.
Mas o fato é que eu jamais esperava que a fome voltasse nesse país. Jamais.
To tackle these issues, Lula wants to build more affordable housing, bring water and electricity to remote villages, take on major infrastructure projects like new public transportation, increase the minimum wage, and revive Bolsa Familia. See, Bolsonaro rebranded Bolsa Familia into a new program and boosted cash payments ahead of the 2022 election. But he also placed a budget cap on the program, making it impossible to pay out all families through 2023, endangering the program's solvency. So Lula will have to negotiate with Congress to fund the program in both the short and long term. Now, back in the 2000s, Lula could just rely on Brazil's rapidly growing economy to fund policies like Bolsa Familia. But today, Brazil's economy is in a very different place.
Sem dúvida nenhuma, o pior dos mundos que a gente está vivendo hoje, quando se trata de política monetária e economia no Brasil.
Lula's agenda doesn't just include social spending. He also plans to halt and reverse Bolsonaro's deforestation policies in the Amazon, and to rebuild indigenous and environmental groups that were undermined by that administration.
É uma vergonha para o nosso país ter governo que ele não entende da luta indígena, não conhece a população indígena na realidade de verdade.
Like in the US, much of Lula's presidential agenda would have to get through Congress first. And that might be tricky, because Brazil's Congress is currently dominated by right-wing parties. On top of that, while Lula defeated Bolsonaro in October's runoff election, to do so, he needed to win over Brazil's business interests, and even center-right politicians. And even then, he only won by a razor-thin margin. These more conservative, pro-business voices are even members of Lula's administration, like Vice President Geraldo Alckmin, a former political rival. To make matters even more difficult, many Bolsonaro voters have refused to accept that their candidate legitimately lost the last election. Sound familiar?
Observou nos últimos anos uma ativação ideológica de uma parcela considerável da população em valores antidemocráticos.
But Lula didn't return to power simply by striking deals with business-friendly politicians. There's a big progressive movement in Brazil, and many organizations say they'll continue to put pressure on Lula to stick to his promises, both by making demands of Lula's government directly as part of his coalition, and also by mobilizing on their own when needed. These movements still contend that more progress will be possible under Lula than under Bolsonaro, even keeping in mind the concessions that might happen under the new government. Environmental Minister Lula da Silva says that when it comes to environmental concerns, this mobilization strategy is vital.
Nós vamos ter uma sociedade civil mobilizada, uma comunidade científica muito ativa e mobilizada, contexto de uma agenda internacional.
For his part, Lula acknowledges the hard road ahead.
Estou aqui para governar esse país numa situação muito difícil, mas eu tenho fé em Deus que com a ajuda do povo nós vamos encontrar uma saída para que esse país volte a viver democraticamente, harmonicamente.
With Lula's new political allies, a polarized country, and a collapsing economy, his third term is bound to look very different from his first two. And if Lula 3.0 can't deliver on his progressive agenda, he might lose the support of the movements that helped put him in power, and that could determine whether he's as beloved this time around as he was over a decade ago.
Luta pelo bem do Brasil. Usaremos as armas que os nossos adversários mais temem. A verdade que se sobrepôs à mentira, a esperança que venceu o medo e o amor que derrotou o ódio. Viva o Brasil e viva o povo brasileiro!